Good afternoon. Before we get into the lecture, does anybody have any questions about the upcoming assignment, any other matter dealing with the course, or some of the material? Is there some question that you might have?
Yeah, one small question. I saw that the assignment is technically
Could you
due on
speak up a bit? Could you speak up a bit? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I saw that the assignment was due on a Sunday. Did you meant to put it on that, or is it supposed to be due
It's
Monday?
make it Monday.
All right,
Okay.
thank you.
So,
Oh, I submitted.
hello.
Hi, sorry, I just saw the email and I submitted mine because I thought it was.
You did submit it.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say I have read, some people sent me their work, what do I think of it, and so on. And generally, the responses are pretty good. I think staying close to the text is quite important in this particular assignment. Ordinarily, in university work, one wants to uh, develop the capacity to do sort of independent work, to express things in one's own thoughts. In other words, you take the material that you're reading and so on, and you work it through your mind so that it becomes part of you, and then you deploy it, you use it in the essay in a way that gives the essay a certain kind of independent existence that comes from you, rather than simply regurgitating what's coming from the books. But at this stage, and for this particular assignment, because I laid so much stress on these important definitions, sticking close to the text is a pretty good idea. So that's what I would say. I'm looking forward to what you're able to produce, and I think on Monday, or no, it's the week after, these tutors will come in, and uh, there are these personal tutors available in this particular course, and you're going to get more, especially looking towards the second assignment where you actually have to produce the essay. You'll get some substantial assistance. So today, what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try and review another review question, and then get back into the discussion of the Ottomans. And I think the most important part of the lecture will be the discussion of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. So first of all, I think we're dealing with the review question 12 at this point, which deals with uh, uh, asking you to contextualize the English Revolution. Well, in the first place, in answering this question, I would say that one should say that capitalism developed very strongly in England in the 16th and early 17th century. It started in agriculture with the enclosure movement. It then led, because England had this great wool industry, huge numbers of sheep, and very fine quality wool. With the help of the crown, protected this industry. A very strong wool cloth manufacturing industry developed, and English wool cloth became the standard all over Europe and beyond. And so the combination of increasing surpluses in agriculture and the development of the wool cloth industry led to a rapid rise in exports, and the development of a powerful navy and merchant marine. That's for capitalism. Now, the capitalism was controlled by what we call the rising middle class or the rising bourgeoisie. This was a mixed group, heterogeneous or mixed group, composed of rich farmers, merchants, lesser gentlemen, and even skilled craftsmen. If you were a craftsman and were prosperous, you were you could accumulate enough wealth that in the next generation you might go into manufacturing, or one of your sons might become a capitalist farmer. So skilled craftsmen were part of this group of emerging bourgeoisie. Now, the third aspect in terms of discussing capitalism is the growing influence of Puritanism, which I explained comes from Calvin's Geneva. And we're not going to go back into the theology, but I'm now talking about the social implications. The social implications can be summed up in the Protestant ethic, that is to say, the demand for an austere way of life. You're not supposed to waste your money. You save your money. It is God's will that you labor diligently. So work discipline, austerity, work discipline, and these things favoring the accumulation of capital. And at the same time, these so-called Puritans were hostile to the remnants of what they considered to be the Catholic Church. That is to say, in the Anglican Church, as reformed by Henry VIII, they found many Catholic remnants, like stained glass windows. They wanted to get rid of them because they were not biblical. And furthermore, as time wore on, they came to criticize the flamboyant and corrupt and sensual lifestyle of the aristocracy and of the king and the court. So this is Puritanism. So capitalism is an economic system. The middle class is the director of this capitalism, and the ideology is Puritanism. Now, all of this amounts, this movement in the middle class represents essentially a critique of the old feudal structure based on the king, the aristocracy, and the established church. Now, so you have this increasingly coherent middle class, and it finds expression in the parliament, especially in the House of Commons. During the 16th and 17th century, the House of Commons becomes increasingly organized and confident. And eventually, it is through this instrument of the parliament that the middle class challenges the monarchy. So in terms of the evolution of parliament, really, we have three elements. First of all, during the reign of Henry VIII, the Reformation took place in England, and Henry VIII used the parliament as the legalizing instrument. The statutes passed by the parliament to basically legalize the break with Rome. And so parliament became an intrinsic part of the English Constitution as a result. Furthermore, Henry, and then secondly, his daughter, Elizabeth I, needed the monies, the subsidies granted by Parliament to defend England. And in particular, during the reign of Elizabeth, there was a constant threat of Catholic subversion or a Spanish invasion. And so the Parliament, for the most part, loyal to Elizabeth I, supported the monarchy. And as this process went on, you see that the Parliament becomes increasingly confident of itself. It organizes itself into subcommittees. It has a growing sense of its privileges, of its traditions. And so this then becomes the instrument of eventually what becomes the political opposition to the direct political opposition to the monarchy by the middle class. And this ultimately breaks out at the beginning of the 17th century in the reign of the Stuarts, James I and Charles I. James I's reign, 1603 to 25, is marked by a continuous series of clashes with the House of Commons in Parliament over foreign policy, too friendly to the Catholic powers, over demands by the Puritan members of the House of Commons for a reform of the church, get rid of the Catholic remnants, and criticism of the decadence of the court, and also complaints that the monarchy is interfering with the development of the economy, because the James I, seeing how the middle class is getting stronger and stronger, tends to limit it by prohibiting enclosures, by supporting the guild system, which basically inhibits the freedom of labor, and setting up monopolies, favoring certain merchants at the expense of others. But under James, things do not lead to an open clash between the monarchy and the Parliament. This comes under James's son, Charles I, who reigns from 1625 to 42. And he calls a series of parliaments. He has a war to run. He's involved in a war, and he needs money. And when the Parliament assembles, they refuse, without concessions on the part of the king, they refuse to vote him taxes. So by 1628, he suspends Parliament, and Parliament will not meet again until 1640. And basically, he then turns to a policy of basically trying to implement absolutism on the style of the French and Spanish monarchy. And the main thing he does, in the name of protecting England, he basically collects taxes to build up the navy, the so-called ship money, without consent of Parliament. He pursues a foreign policy which is friendly to France and Spain. He purges, using his archbishop, the Puritans from the church and from the universities. And in Ireland, this is a colony of England at this point, he basically institutes a colonial policy based on absolutism as a kind of experiment of what he intends to do in England. And the result is that the supporters of the Parliament, and particularly the Puritans all over England, are furious, and the population in general is alienated. When war breaks out between England and Scotland in 1638, the army deserts. Northern England is occupied, and the king is forced to call Parliament. The English Revolution begins, and that's the story. Okay, having said, is there any question about that presentation? Obviously, I would say you can't, in an essay question, you can't recapitulate everything I've said, but what you need to do is try your best. And using various elements of what you can gather from what I've said, it's all on the lecture notes, or hopefully in the lectures. You put together an essay if it comes up on the final exam. Now I want to turn back now to to the Ottomans. And we were discussing the millet system. I would say, I remarked last time, I thought the millet system worked, which began under Mehmed II and was perfected under Solomon. It worked quite well in the sense that it helped to reconcile, because there was so much self-government, not only religious kind, but also political at the local level, for the subject populations, the protected flocks, the Jews, the Christians, that in many ways they had a stake in the system. And moreover, there was relatively little conflict between the different ethnic groups, because they, in terms of daily life, they each kept to themselves. And of course, they would go into the marketplace to do business, but for the most part, they kept to themselves. And I would say that there was a de facto toleration in Ottoman society. Obviously, the Muslims, especially the Turks, were the most favored, but there was a great deal of autonomy. As I said, everything was segregated into these different millets. And people kept to themselves, each community kept to itself. The one exception, I would say, is some of the big cities, and particularly Istanbul, which had, of course, it had thousands of Turks, but there were many Christians and Jews and even Westerners, like the Phoenicians, for example, who were constantly doing business with the Turks, who lived in Constantinople. And there, I would say, there was a great deal of mixing and what I would call cosmopolitanism, that is, say, a mixing of populations, which was not true elsewhere. As I said, there was rather segregation was the rule. So that's the overall view of things. On the other hand, I would say that under Turkish and Muslim control, there did continue to be a certain amount of tension between the Jews and the Christians, even under the Ottomans. In Western Europe, this was a terrible problem, but even in the Ottoman Empire, especially as time wore on, conflict between Jews and Christians did develop. And I want to go into this a little bit because, well, it's inherently interesting. And of course, it has its own history if you're doing European history. These relationships between attitudes between the Jews and the Christians. Now, anti-Semitism in Western Europe really got going in the 13th and especially the 14th centuries. The 14th century began the sort of late Middle Ages, and things began to deteriorate economically. And this economic tension led to social tension and religious conflict between the Christian majority and the Jewish minority. It began in England and France, and by the beginning of the 14th century, the Jews had been expelled from England and France. They were told to get out. Now, the places where they went to Spain and they went into Germany for refuge. Well, toleration still existed in Spain, but as we've seen, the same thing basically happened in Spain as happened in England and France earlier. In the 15th century, you begin to get more and more pressure to get rid of the Jews. An important source of this hostility to the Jews, even in England and France, but also in Spain, is the middle class. Whatever middle class existed in Spain, likewise in England and France, the middle class, the Christian middle class, saw the Jews as competitors. After all, the leaders of the Jewish community were big merchants. So the idea was use religion to get rid of them. And this is what happened in Spain, as it had earlier in England and France. And then in Germany, too, in the 15th and beginning of the 16th century, the same thing is happening. And you see that in Germany, where there was a substantial Jewish population, these people were expelled into Poland, which was this Christian Catholic, very large feudal state to the east of Germany. And that became, along with the Ottoman Empire, the main refuge of the Jews in the early modern and modern period. Especially, these are the Ashkenazim, so-called. The Sephardic Jews from Spain took refuge in the Ottoman Empire. The Ashkenazim, they fled into Poland, where the Jews constituted anything like by the 18th century, 1/3 of the Polish population were Jewish. So this is an important fact of history. Now, when, as this anti-Semitism developed in the late Middle Ages, it had various sort of ideological components. After all, the Jews, it was said, had killed Christ. That was the main thing. The Jews were usurers, but a particular charge that was drawn against them was something called the blood libel. The blood libel, which appears in England and France in the 13th century. Now, this blood libel was a story, a fiction, which claimed that the Jews, one of their important holidays was the Passover, and they made unleavened bread, a special bread for this holiday. And that secretly the Jews used the blood of little Christian boys to bake the matzah, to bake the unleavened bread. And this untruth was widely believed, and we see it invoked in Germany and France and England in the late Middle Ages. And then again in Eastern Europe, later, as late as the early 20th century, we see cases of blood libel in Russia. But particularly, we do see that as the tension between Jews and Christians developed in the Ottoman Empire, the blood libel was used and used repeatedly by the Greek Orthodox and Armenian Christians. The merchants who were competing with the Jews in the marketplace, the Christian merchants, would use this libel as a way of discrediting the Jews and getting the authority on their side. And there were numerous trials and even riots and so on against the Jews, especially as time wore on and things in the Ottoman Empire were not going well by the late 16th, 17th centuries. This fueled this anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, countries like France, which was gaining more and more influence in the Ottoman Empire, I'm saying Western countries, especially France, used this whole sort of blood libel thing, and in order to support their allies, who were the Armenian and the Greek merchants. The French and the other Western powers tended to support the Christian merchants, the Armenian and the Greek Orthodox merchants. And so there was this reality, this undercurrent. As again, I want to say the Millet system generally worked, but there was this reality that did deploy itself in the late 16th, 17th, and even 18th century. Now, another group that was declining in this period were the Arabs. The Arabs were declining because the Armenian and Greek Orthodox merchants were being favored. And in a circumstance where the Ottoman Empire was in decline, the Jewish and Arab merchants were losing out, and the Christian merchants were gaining. It is notable that a kind of informal alliance between Jews and Arabs against the Christians, this kind of tension did develop. I single it out again because I want to make the point that economics and politics changes things. Today, supposedly, the Jews and the Arabs are, are enemies, but back then that was not the case. In any case, now I want to talk more now. Enter into the whole question of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. What were the factors? And there were many factors. What were the factors that lay behind this failure of the Ottoman Empire? It had a great start, right? Mehmed II, Solomon the Magnificent, they went from success to success. But starting in the late 16th century and continuing from there on, no, setback after setback after setback, and contradictions, difficulties developed. So what were they? Well, first of all, let's start with the inner service, or the harem, and the upper levels of the government, the so-called the viziers and the imperial council. It is said that after Solomon, the quality of the sultans, after all, they had this series of great sultans, Mehmed II, Selim I, Solomon the Magnificent. These were great leaders who led great military campaigns and so on, but also established a very solid government. Why did things, well, we see that the quality of these monarchs decline. And not only did they decline, but the sultans became the victim of the harem. That is to say, the harem was thousands of people, the inner service. There were all these eunuchs and slaves and women and children running around. The sultans were not particularly bright or political, and so factions developed within the harem around these. Some of the more powerful women formed alliances with the slaves of some of the top eunuchs, and you have this faction fighting and corruption and favor seeking within the court. This becomes a preoccupation of the politics at the topmost level, and so there's a kind of fundamental rot or weakness at the very top of Ottoman government, lack of direction. But I would say that this is often invoked as the reasons why the Ottoman Empire declined, and certainly it makes a certain amount of sense. But when you see this, now generalizing, when you see this kind of government, when you see a government that is increasingly off the rails, behaving erratically, and steeped in corruption, I won't mention the present government in the United States of America. At this point, I'll have more to say about that. But when you see this, it is symptomatic of deeper forces at work, is what I'm saying. Of course, the surface of politics is always important. And what this politician does and what that politician does, it's always important and even amusing to follow this. But I think if you see a lot of problems in an existing government, it's important to look for underlying symptoms, what lay at a deeper level. And I would say that from a structural point of view, I would say the most important political problem was the conflict between the old Turkish elite, the ruling elite, and these Christian Janissary leaders, the kids who had been taken away and had been converted to Islam. they constituted two factions within the military and even within the political structure of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the strong sultans had been able to control this, but what one sees is after Solomon the Magnificent, often it is the case that conflict between these two groups actually leads to an open conflict over who is exactly going to be the sultan. And there are cases of one sultan being assassinated by the other side, and veritable civil wars for a while. And so this conflict got worse rather than better as time wore on. So that's a factor. Another factor that some historians have pointed out, remember when I spoke about the Ottoman Empire, sorry, the Spanish Empire, I noted that in the early 16th century, Charles V and so on, there were huge amounts of bullion flowing in, gold and silver, from the New World. And this was fundamental to the imperial aspirations of the Spaniards. But that by the beginning of this 17th century, the supply of silver began to peter out. And after all, Spain is on one side of the Mediterranean, the Ottoman Empire is on the other. The problem of a lack of silver to basically pay for things begins to develop in the Ottoman Empire in the same way as it does in Spain. However, I think this is a problem, but we could take it a step further or look a little bit more deeply. And what we note is that by the late 16th century, the Atlantic, Holland and England, northern France, is becoming dominant in the global economy. The Mediterranean is becoming a backwater. And so the economic base of the Ottoman Empire, as a result of this, begins to weaken and weaken and weaken because the economic center of gravity of Europe is shifting to the northwest, and the Mediterranean world is becoming secondary and dependent on Northern Europe. And this obviously is affecting the economy of the Ottoman Empire. The Dutch are now using the South Atlantic and the Indian Ocean to reach Asia, and the Mediterranean Near Eastern route through the Ottoman Empire to India and China is in full decline. And without this economic base, clearly the whole basis of the empire is weakening. Now, at this point, it's important to say that there is a choice here, because in the face of this, a government could decide, well, the government in Istanbul could have decided, well, our economy is getting weak. We need to bolster the economy. We need a program of economic development. We need what Henry IV or the kings of England are doing, that is to say, state-directed economic development or mercantilism to develop the Ottoman economy so that we can sustain the political structure and, above all, sustain the military. No such thing happened. Because of the institutional structure of the Ottoman Empire, because of the preoccupation with religion, science, technology, economic development are all neglected or ignored, and no creative response to this crisis is forthcoming. No reform is forthcoming. So things get worse. And the Ottoman state, instead of developing the economy, in fact, undermines the economy. How do they do this? Well, the sultans, based on the advice he's given, says, well, we have to maintain our army, we have to maintain our navy, we have to maintain our administration, and I must maintain my court or harem. how do we do this in the face of declining revenues? We have to tax the people more. We have to impose more and more taxes on the population. So in the 17th and early 18th century, the response, completely destructive response, is to tax the productive elements of the population, the merchants, the peasants, the craftsmen, to tax them to death, to weaken them, because the Sultan needs money. And so this is a fatal error. And what you see is that commercial life, that is, say, in the hands of the Jews, the Arabs, is in decline, and the peasants are actually being forced off the land. Not all the peasants, but many of them actually lose their land and become paupers or bandits, or they flee to the cities. They can't find jobs in the city, but they flee to the city and become simply poor in the towns. There is a decline in the productive classes in society. This is all really bad. So I would say that is certainly this tax policy, the rise of the North Atlantic, the Ottoman rulers' taxation policies, and I also mentioned the fact that the religion bred certain attitudes which were detrimental to a kind of anti-rationalism, which was detrimental to the development of innovation within Ottoman society. I think that of all of the things that I've mentioned, the factors that I've been singling out are very important. Now, in addition to this, I would say another very important, in the wake of the growing weakness of the Ottomans, another very important factor in explaining decline is the intrusion of the West, the intrusion of the Western powers, the intrusion of the Europeans, who take advantage of the growing weakness of the Ottomans. Until, say, the beginning of the 17th century, we can say that there was a rough balance of trade between the East and the West. That is to say, the Western countries, France, England, the Netherlands, Germany, sent manufactured goods and other products to the Near East, and the Near East, the Ottoman Empire, sent its products, its silks, its carpets, its fine steel work, its glass work. It sent these products into Europe. There was a rough equilibrium. But by the beginning of the 17th century, the European economy, particularly the advanced capitalist economies, had grown so strong that now, backed up by their governments, backed up by their navies, the European powers, particularly the advanced ones, England, France, the Netherlands, begin to send their manufactured commodities in very large numbers, cloth above all, but many other things like weapons and all sorts of steel manufactured products, flooding into the Ottoman Empire. These products are of high quality, but also the Western traders have supported their governments, and they bully the Ottomans. And we see that the balance of payments changes decisively in the favor of the Europeans and against the Ottoman Empire. In other words, the Europeans are basically encroaching on and undermining the independence of the Ottoman economy. The Ottoman Empire, by the 17th century, is becoming economically dependent on the European economy. Unequal exchange, this is the way it's often put, develops between the Ottoman Empire and Europe. And the Ottoman Empire, until its end, becomes more and more integrated in and dependent on European capitalism. essentially the same thing happens to the Ottoman Empire has already happened to Latin America. Third world dependence on the advanced capitalist countries, it's already beginning to show its face in the 17th century. So in the course of the 17th century, we see that this change in economic relations is beginning to fundamentally affect political relations, to the point where the European ambassadors at the court in Istanbul, they present a series of demands to the Sultan, basically saying that our citizens who are Christians should not be tried in the courts of the Ottoman Empire, the religious courts of the Ottoman Empire. In other words, should not be subject to Ottoman law. And so, furthermore, we want certain other special privileges for our citizens. And the sultans, who are increasingly in debt to the Europeans, sign treaties, unequal treaties. They're called capitulation treaties, in which the French, the Dutch, the English are given special privileges within the Ottoman Empire. And indeed, particularly notable is the extraterritoriality, in the sense of the right of the Westerners to be tried in their own courts in the Ottoman Empire. So this gives you a sense of how the Ottoman Empire enters into decline. And once again, I want to deal with this because we're coming to the end. How much time do I have? I still have some time. Okay. I want to also say that I want to come back to the whole question of the situation of Jews and Muslims under these circumstances of decline. Now, in terms of the Muslims, let's see if I can, what you have is religious movements developing with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is increasingly unable to cope with the realities, political and economic, that are developing around it. And so you see amongst the Muslims, the Turks, as well as the Arabs, a whole series of religious movements of a mystical kind developing amongst the Muslims. And amongst the Jews, I'll come back to the Muslims in a bit, but amongst the Jews, something even more extraordinary takes place. That is to say, amongst the Jews, there is an outgrowth of what I would call Messianism. Messianism, that is to say, the belief that one of their number is the actual Jewish Messiah, that the Jewish Messiah has actually arrived. And amongst the Jews, a huge movement develops, particularly around this rabbi, Jewish holy man, by the name of Sabbatai Sevi. Might as well consider this because it's an extraordinary event. Sabbatai Sevi lived in what is today Croatia, in the ex-Yugoslavia. You're probably familiar with this area of the world. Some nice beaches there and so on. Anyway, he was a Jewish holy man and rabbi up in Croatia. He was a mystic, and he suddenly got into his head that, in fact, he was the Jewish Messiah. Now, the idea of a Messiah is part of Jewish religion. It dates back to Roman times. In fact, as you probably know, Jesus was himself a Jew, and the people around him, and they had a sense that God would intervene, and he would send a Messiah to basically deliver the Jewish people. Jesus' original claim was he was that Messiah, or his disciples claimed that. Well, most of the Jews under their rabbis rejected this idea, A minority of the Jews became Christians, and that's how the Christian religion developed. But as a result of that, the Jews, although it was part of their religion, they rejected Messianism because, of course, that had been the basis of Christianity, and there was this conflict. But lo and behold, in the late 17th century, this guy suddenly claims he is the true Jewish Messiah. God has sent him directly to redeem the Jewish people. Well, this is extraordinary. And in many, well, all over the Mediterranean, and even as far as Holland and Poland, the Jewish population goes wild. They believe it. And the Messiah is, and they're dancing in the streets. The observers who are non-Jewish, Christians and others, skeptics, they're laughing at the Jews because they're out in the streets. They think the end of the world has come, and they are delivered. Well, the Sultan hears about this. He calls Sabbatai Sevi to Istanbul, and he's brought into the court in chains, and he says to Sabbatai Sevi, "Convert to Islam, or we'll cut off your head right here and now." So Sabbatai Sevi, he converts to Islam. Converts. He claims he's the Messiah, but he converts to Islam, and that's the end of it. And basically the Jewish population was humiliated by this incident. In many synagogues, they had recorded this event in their chronicles. We see that these pages in their chronicles are torn out because they're trying to obliterate the memory of this. But why had this happened? Because the Jews were suffering terribly economically, and indeed in Poland and in Southern Europe, there were terrible pogroms going on, launched by the Christians against the Jews, and this was a kind of religious response to persecution. Now, nothing like this did happen amongst the Muslims, but you do find that in many places, people are turning to a kind of Muslim mysticism, including raptures and wild dancing, because likewise, the fortunes of the Muslims are again in decline. In 1648, finally, an attempt is made to revive the flagging fortunes of the Ottoman Empire. Things have gotten so bad, corruption is so rife, economic decline is so evident that finally a sultan manages to reach the throne by the name of Mehmed IV. And Mehmed IV launches an attempt to reform the Ottoman Empire. But it is very interesting. I think I'll stop at this point because I'm getting into a new section. So I wish you a very good weekend, and let's all try to survive on a personal basis this pandemic. I'll see you on Monday.